3 months later, Sarah stood in the approach control facility at Naval Air Station Pensacola, wearing a headset and watching radar displays with an intensity that surprised even her. The refresher training had been more challenging than she had anticipated, but also more exhilarating. 8 years of suppressed knowledge had come flooding back, enhanced by new technologies and procedures she had only read about in journals. Falcon 27, turn left heading 090, descend and maintain 3000, she spoke into her microphone, her voice calm and professional. The aircraft responded immediately, its symbol on the radar screen adjusting course exactly as she had directed. Excellent work, Phoenix, said her training supervisor, using the call sign that had been assigned to her when she officially joined the Navy's air traffic control program. The name felt strange at first, but increasingly natural as weeks passed. She was no longer just Sarah Martinez, Navy wife. She was Phoenix, air traffic control specialist. The irony of the call sign wasn't lost on her. Phoenix, the mythical bird that rises from ashes, reborn and renewed. It seemed appropriate for someone who had rediscovered herself after years of dormancy. Her training supervisor was Commander Lisa Chen, a woman about Sarah's age who had successfully balanced her own naval career with marriage and motherhood. Lisa had become not just a professional mentor, but a friend who understood the complexities of military life and dual careers. "You're ready for independent operations," Lisa announced as Sarah completed her shift. "I've never seen someone pick up the rhythm this quickly, especially after such a long break." Sarah removed her headset, feeling the familiar satisfaction that came from successfully managing complex air traffic. "It feels like coming home," she admitted. "I didn't realize how much I had missed this until I was doing it again." "Admiral Richardson is scheduled to visit next week for your final evaluation. I think he's going to be very pleased with your progress." The mention of Admiral Richardson brought back memories of that pivotal day in the air traffic control tower, when her carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled. He had continued to take a personal interest in her training, checking on her progress and ensuring she had all the resources needed to succeed. As Sarah drove home to the base housing they had been assigned at Pensacola, she reflected on how much had changed in just 3 months. The transition hadn't been easy. There had been arguments, adjustments, and moments when both she and James wondered if they had made the right decision. The hardest part had been learning to see herself as someone with her own professional identity again. For 8 years she had introduced herself as Commander Martinez's wife. Now she was training herself to say, "I'm Sarah Martinez and I work in air traffic control." James had surprised her with his adaptability. His own career had required adjustments, including a lateral transfer to a position that would allow them to remain at Pensacola for an extended period. He had made the choice willingly, even though it meant delaying his own promotion timeline. "How was your day?" James asked as Sarah entered their new home, a slightly larger unit than their previous quarters, with windows that faced the approach path to the runway. "Challenging and wonderful," Sarah replied, kissing him hello. "Lisa says I'm ready for independent operations." "That's fantastic. I'm proud of you." The simple words carried weight because Sarah knew James meant them. The adjustment period had taught them both things about marriage they hadn't understood before. James had learned that supporting his wife's career didn't diminish his own accomplishments. And Sarah had discovered that pursuing her dreams didn't mean loving her husband any less. "Admiral Richardson is coming for my final evaluation next week," Sarah mentioned as they prepared dinner together. A domestic routine that had become more collaborative since they both had demanding careers. "Nervous?" "A little. He's been so supportive throughout this process, and I want to prove that his faith in me was justified." The week passed quickly, filled with increasingly complex training scenarios designed to test Sarah's skills under pressure. She handled emergency procedures, equipment failures, and multiple aircraft conflicts with the kind of calm competence that impressed even the veteran controllers who observed her sessions. Admiral Richardson arrived on a Wednesday morning, observing quietly as Sarah worked through a particularly challenging training exercise involving military and civilian aircraft in mixed operations. She was so focused on her work that she barely noticed his presence until the scenario concluded. "Outstanding work, Phoenix," Admiral Richardson said as she removed her headset. "You've exceeded every expectation we had for this program." "Thank you, sir. The training has been incredible and Commander Chen is an excellent supervisor. I'm not just talking about your technical skills, although those are impressive. I'm talking about your development as a professional. When I first met you 3 months ago, you were hiding your expertise behind the role of a supportive spouse. Today, I'm watching a confident air traffic controller who happens to also be married to a naval officer. Admiral Richardson's words hit home because they reflected exactly how Sarah felt about herself. She had reclaimed not just her technical skills but her professional identity and confidence. "Mrs. Martinez, I have another proposition for you," Admiral Richardson continued. "We're expanding this training program to other bases, and we need someone to lead the development of the curriculum and training standards. It would mean travel, increased responsibility, and the opportunity to shape how the Navy approaches civilian to military air traffic control training." Sarah felt her breath catch. "Sir, that sounds like an incredible opportunity." "It is. And you've proven you have the expertise and leadership abilities to handle it. The question is whether you're ready for that level of professional commitment." Sarah looked around the approach control facility, thinking about how far she had come in just 3 months. Then she thought about James and the sacrifices he had made to support her return to aviation. Most importantly, she thought about the young woman she used to be, the one who had dreamed of making a difference in aviation, and realized that this opportunity would allow her to do exactly that. "I'm very interested, sir, but I would need to discuss it with my husband." "Of course. Take your time to consider it." That evening, Sarah and James walked along the beach near their base housing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Aircraft from the training base passed overhead periodically, their navigation lights blinking in the gathering darkness. "So," James said, taking her hand as they walked. "Ready to become a program director?" Sarah squeezed his hand. "Are you ready to be married to one?" "I think I'm ready to be married to the real you, whatever that means for both of our careers." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face her husband. "James, I need you to know that choosing this career doesn't mean I regret choosing you 8 years ago. It just means I'm finally figuring out how to choose both." "I know," James replied, pulling her close. "And I need you to know that I'm proud of who you're becoming. Not just proud of your professional success, but proud that you had the courage to reclaim yourself." As they stood on the beach with aircraft passing overhead and the sound of waves washing against the shore, Sarah reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this point. Admiral Richardson had recognized something in her that day in the air traffic control tower, something she had been hiding from the world and from herself. Now, months later, she was ready to step fully into her professional identity, while maintaining the marriage that meant everything to her. She was Phoenix rising from the ashes of her abandoned dreams, ready to soar again. The call sign that had once seemed like a fantasy was now her professional identity, representing not just her technical expertise but her personal transformation. When she spoke into her headset, guiding aircraft safely through complex airspace, she was using her voice not just as an air traffic controller, but as a woman who had found the courage to be authentically herself. Everyone had seen a Navy wife, but Admiral Richardson had heard her call sign and in doing so, had helped her remember who she really was. The car ride home from the base was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of aircraft overhead. James gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the black leather. Sarah stared out the passenger window, watching the familiar landscape of base housing blur past, everything looking the same yet somehow completely different now that her secret was out. When they pulled into their driveway, James turned off the engine but made no move to get out of the car. They sat in the gathering dusk, both struggling with emotions they hadn't anticipated facing. 8 years, James said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "For 8 years you've been pretending to be someone you're not." Sarah turned to face him, seeing the pain in his eyes. "I wasn't pretending, James, I was adapting. I was becoming the woman I thought you needed me to be. But I fell in love with you, Sarah, the real you, the brilliant, passionate woman I met at that party, who talked about her dreams of working in aviation. When did you decide that person wasn't good enough for me?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You told me that military marriages work best when one spouse provides stable support for the other's career. You said you'd seen too many naval officers held back by wives who were competing for attention and resources." James ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Sarah recognized as his way of dealing with stress. "I was 26 years old and repeating things I'd heard from older officers. I was scared of messing up my career and I thought I was being practical about marriage. He looked at her with regret etched on his face. I never meant to ask you to disappear, but that's what happened, isn't it? I disappeared so completely that even I forgot who I used to be sometimes. They finally went inside, moving through their evening routine with careful politeness, both of them processing the day's revelations. Sarah prepared dinner while James reviewed his notes for Monday's debriefing, but the normal domestic rhythm felt strained and artificial. Over dinner, James broke the silence again. Tell me about the FAA program. What was it like when you got accepted? Sarah set down her fork, surprised by the question. It was the most exciting moment of my life up to that point. The selection process was incredibly competitive, and when I got the acceptance letter, I called my parents crying with joy. I had this vision of my future working in a major airport tower, being part of something important and challenging. And then you met me. And then I met you, and everything changed. Not just my career plans, but my whole sense of what I wanted from life. I fell in love with you, James. That wasn't a sacrifice or a compromise. That was real. But giving up the FAA program was a sacrifice. Sarah nodded slowly. Yes, a huge one. But I convinced myself it was worth it because what we had together was special. Was it wrong of me to ask you to give that up? I don't know, Sarah answered honestly. Maybe we were both too young to understand what we were really asking of each other. You needed someone who could handle the demands of military life, and I wanted to be that person for you. But somewhere along the way, I lost track of my own needs and dreams. James was quiet for a long moment, pushing food around his plate. Admiral Richardson offered you something, didn't he? Sarah looked up, surprised. How did you know? The way he was talking about Navy personnel shortages and training programs. He wasn't just making conversation. He mentioned that the Navy needs experienced people to help train air traffic controllers. He suggested that my background might be valuable, even after all these years. What did you tell him? That it was too late for me. That I'd made my choice years ago. James set down his fork and looked directly at her. What if it's not too late? What if we could find a way to make this work? Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. James, your career is at a critical point. You're up for promotion to full commander, and you can't afford any complications or distractions. Maybe my career shouldn't be the only consideration anymore. Maybe it's time we figured out how to support each other's dreams instead of just mine. They talked late into the night, sharing feelings and fears they had both been carrying alone. Sarah told James about the night she lay awake listening to aircraft overhead, wondering what her life might have been like. James admitted that he had sometimes felt guilty about how much he had asked her to give up, but had convinced himself that she was happy with their life together. I was happy, Sarah assured him. Most of the time I really was. But there was always this part of me that felt incomplete, like I was living someone else's life. Sunday morning brought unexpected visitors. Admiral Richardson arrived at their door with Captain Harrison, the base's air operations officer. Sarah invited them in, offering coffee and wondering what could be so important that it couldn't wait for the regular duty day. Mrs. Martinez, Admiral Richardson began once they were seated in the living room. I've spent the last day thinking about our conversation, and I've discussed your situation with Captain Harrison. We have a proposition for you. Sarah glanced at James, who nodded encouragingly. The Navy is piloting a new program for training civilian air traffic controllers who want to transition to military operations. We need someone with your background to help develop the curriculum and serve as a training supervisor. It would be a civilian position, so it wouldn't interfere with Commander Martinez's career, but it would allow you to use your knowledge and experience in a meaningful way. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. I haven't worked in the field for 8 years. My certifications have lapsed. That can be addressed, Captain Harrison said. We would provide refresher training and help you get current again. The question is whether you're interested in the opportunity. Sarah looked at James, trying to read his expression. I would need to think about it. Discuss it with my husband. Of course, Admiral Richardson said, but I want you to know that your knowledge and insights yesterday were impressive. You have a natural understanding of air traffic control that can't be taught. It would be a shame to waste that talent. After the officers left, Sarah and James sat on their couch, both overwhelmed by the unexpected opportunity. What do you think? James asked. I think I'm terrified, Sarah admitted. It's been so long since I thought of myself as anything other than your wife. I'm not sure I remember how to be Sarah the air traffic control expert. Maybe it's time to find out. Maybe it's time for both of us to figure out who we can be together. instead of who we think we should be. Sarah looked at her husband, seeing not just the naval officer she had married, but the man who was willing to reconsider everything they had built together in order to help her rediscover herself. Are you sure about this? Your career, our life, everything could change. James took her hand, his grip warm and steady. Sarah, I've watched you support my dreams for 8 years. I think it's time I learned how to support yours. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a spark of excitement about the future, not just as Commander Martinez's wife, but as herself. The call sign she had once dreamed of using in air traffic control towers seemed like a possibility again, no longer just a fantasy from her abandoned past, but perhaps a reality in her future. The silence in the air traffic control tower stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Sarah could feel James's confused stare, sense Linda Peterson's shocked expression, and see the controllers glancing between their work and this unexpected drama unfolding in their professional sanctuary. Admiral Richardson stepped closer, his expression serious, but not unkind. Mrs. Martinez, I think we need to have a private conversation. Would you join me in the tower chief's office? It wasn't really a request. Sarah nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. As they walked toward the small office adjacent to the control cab, she caught James's eye. His face showed a mixture of confusion and concern that made her heart ache. She had never wanted to put him in this position. The tower chief's office was cramped but functional, with charts covering the walls and thick manuals stacked on every available surface. Admiral Richardson closed the door and gestured for Sarah to take a seat across from the desk. Mrs. Martinez, I've been in the Navy for over 3 decades, and I've learned to trust my instincts about people. Right now, my instincts are telling me that you know far more about air traffic control than you're letting on. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady but patient. I'm not here to create problems for you or your husband. I'm here because I'm genuinely curious about what I'm seeing. Sarah stared at her hands folded tightly in her lap. The weight of years of careful deception pressed down on her shoulders. Sir, I don't want to cause any trouble. You're not in trouble, Mrs. Martinez. But I am very interested in understanding how the wife of an operations planning officer acquired such detailed knowledge of air traffic control procedures. The moment of truth had arrived. Sarah could continue the charade, make up some story about picking up information from James or from books, but looking into Admiral Richardson's intelligent eyes, she realized he would see through any deception immediately. And perhaps more importantly, she was tired of lying about who she was. Before I married James, I was studying aeronautical engineering with a specialization in air traffic management, she said quietly. I completed my degree and was accepted into the FAA's air traffic control training program. Admiral Richardson's eyebrows rose slightly. And then I met James. When we got engaged, he made it clear that he expected his wife to support his career, not pursue a demanding career of her own. He felt that 2 high-stress jobs in one family would be too much strain on our marriage. So you gave up your career plans? Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar ache of loss she had carried for years. I switched to education, thinking I could always return to aviation later. But between the moves and deployments and James's expectations about what a Navy wife should be, later never came. Admiral Richardson was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Does your husband know about your technical background? He knows I took some engineering courses, but I don't think he understands the depth of my knowledge or how much I gave up. I've never told him about the FAA acceptance or how close I came to becoming a controller myself. Why not? Sarah struggled to find the right words. Because I love him and I knew it would create conflict. His career means everything to him, and I didn't want to be the wife who complained about sacrifices or made him feel guilty about his expectations. But you've been carrying this alone for how many years? 8 years. We've been married 8 years. Admiral Richardson shook his head slowly. Mrs. Martinez, I've seen a lot of talented people over the years, and I've also seen a lot of wasted talent. What I witnessed in that control tower just now wasn't casual knowledge. That was professional-level expertise that you've somehow maintained, despite not working in the field. I read everything I can get my hands on. Technical journals, new procedures, equipment updates. I follow air traffic control forums online and study approach plates when James is deployed. Sarah felt embarrassed admitting how she had secretly maintained her knowledge. I know it sounds pathetic. It doesn't sound pathetic at all. It sounds like someone who has a genuine calling that she's been forced to suppress. Admiral Richardson leaned forward. Mrs. Martinez, what would you say if I told you that the Navy is facing a critical shortage of qualified air traffic controllers, and that we're actively looking for experienced personnel to help train the next generation? Sarah's heart began beating faster. I would say that sounds like an opportunity I gave up the right to pursue years ago. Why? Because you chose marriage over career? Because you spent 8 years supporting your husband's dreams instead of your own? Because that's what I agreed to when I married James. Because that's what being a good Navy wife means. Admiral Richardson stood up and walked to the window overlooking the flight line. Mrs. Martinez, I've been married to my wife for 28 years. She's a doctor, and there have been times when her career demands conflicted with mine. But we figured out how to make it work, because we both believed that supporting each other meant helping each other become the best versions of ourselves, not asking one person to give up their dreams entirely. Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes. It's too late for me, sir. I don't have current certification. I haven't worked in the field, and James would never understand. It's never too late for talent like yours. And as for your husband not understanding, maybe you haven't given him enough credit. Maybe he doesn't know what he's asking you to sacrifice because you've never told him. There was a soft knock on the door, and James's voice came through. Admiral, I'm sorry to interrupt, but is everything all right? Admiral Richardson opened the door. Commander Martinez, please come in. I think it's time for a family conversation. James entered the small office, his confusion evident. Sir, I'm not sure I understand what's happening. Your wife has just shared some very interesting information about her background. Information that I think might surprise you. James looked between the Admiral and Sarah, his expression growing more concerned. What kind of information? Sarah took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been dreading for 8 years, but also the moment she had been unconsciously preparing for. James, there are things about my education and career goals that I never fully explained to you. Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah told her husband everything. About her aeronautical engineering degree, her acceptance into the FAA program, her dreams of becoming an air traffic controller, and how she had spent the last 8 years secretly maintaining her knowledge while playing the role of the supportive wife he wanted her to be. James listened in stunned silence, his face cycling through expressions of shock, confusion, and something that might have been hurt. Why didn't you tell me? He asked when she finished. Because I was afraid you would feel guilty about asking me to give it up, or that you would think I was ungrateful for the life we've built together. But Sarah, I never asked you to give up everything. I just wanted us to prioritize our marriage and family. Admiral Richardson had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. Commander, with respect, your wife gave up a significant career opportunity to support yours. That's not prioritizing marriage, that's one person sacrificing everything for the other person's dreams. James looked stricken. I never meant for it to be that way. I know you didn't, Sarah said softly, and I chose to make that sacrifice. But Admiral Richardson is right about one thing. I've been carrying this alone for too long, and it's been harder than I admitted, even to myself. The three of them sat in the small office, the weight of revelation hanging heavy in the air. Outside, the sounds of aircraft operations continued, a constant reminder of the world Sarah had once hoped to be part of and might, just possibly, have a chance to enter again. The luncheon proceeded with forced normalcy, after Admiral Richardson excused himself to continue his base tour. Sarah tried to participate in the conversations about upcoming charity events and base social activities, but she could feel the curious glances from the other wives. Linda Peterson, in particular, seemed to be studying her with new interest. Sarah, dear, Linda said during dessert, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for extracting information. I had no idea you were so knowledgeable about aviation matters. How wonderful that you share James's professional interests. Sarah forced a smile while carefully choosing her words. I've always found it interesting to learn about what our husbands do. Of course, but your comment to the Admiral was quite specific. Predictive thinking, situational awareness, those aren't terms most of us would know. Linda's eyes sparkled with curiosity. Did you study something related in college, perhaps? The other wives had stopped their own conversations to listen. Sarah felt like a specimen under a microscope, every word being analyzed for clues about this hidden side of Commander Martinez's wife that had suddenly emerged. I took some general engineering courses, Sarah said vaguely. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it was far from the complete truth. Mrs. Thompson, the wife of a lieutenant commander, leaned forward with interest. Engineering? How exciting. What kind of engineering? Before Sarah could answer, Linda's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and gasped. Oh my goodness. The Admiral has requested a private meeting with base spouses who have technical backgrounds. He wants to discuss their perspectives on military, family life, and career balance. She looked directly at Sarah. I wonder if this has anything to do with your conversation this morning. Sarah's heart began racing. A private meeting with the Admiral was the last thing she wanted. I'm sure he has many qualified spouses to choose from. But you're the one who impressed him, Linda insisted. I think you should be honored. It's not every day an Admiral takes such personal interest in the spouses. The afternoon seemed to drag on forever. When Sarah finally returned home, she found James in his study, working on reports for the weekend's exercises. She stood in the doorway, watching him concentrate on his computer screen, and wondered how to tell him about her encounter with the Admiral. How was the luncheon? James asked without looking up. Fine. The Admiral stopped by briefly. Good. I heard he was making rounds to meet everyone. Probably just standard protocol. Sarah took a deep breath. James, I may have said something that drew his attention. Now James looked up, his expression concerned. What kind of something? He was commenting on the air traffic control operations, and I made a remark about situational awareness and predictive thinking. He seemed surprised that I understood those concepts. James frowned. Sarah, you know how important it is to maintain a low profile during these visits. The last thing we need is unwanted attention from flag officers. I know. I just got caught up in the moment. It won't happen again. But even as she said the words, Sarah wasn't sure she could keep that promise. For the first time in years, someone had recognized her knowledge and expertise. The brief moment of intellectual engagement had felt like coming up for air after being underwater too long. That evening, as they prepared for bed, James seemed distracted. Admiral Richardson asked about you during his afternoon briefing, he said casually. Sarah froze while brushing her teeth. What did he ask? Just general questions about your background, how long we've been married, that sort of thing. Nothing unusual, but I got the impression he was more interested than normal. What did you tell him? The truth. That you have a degree in education, that you've been the perfect Navy wife, always supportive of my career. James paused. I didn't mention your early engineering coursework because it didn't seem relevant. Sarah felt a stab of something. Disappointment? Relief? She wasn't sure. Of course not. Why would it be relevant? But as she lay in bed that night, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Admiral Richardson's penetrating gaze and his comment about recognizing when someone truly understood aviation. She had spent so many years suppressing that part of herself that she had almost forgotten how good it felt to be recognized for her intelligence and expertise, rather than just her role as a supportive spouse. Saturday morning brought another surprise. Admiral Richardson had requested a tour of the air traffic control tower, and he specifically asked if any spouses with aviation interest would like to join the tour. Linda Peterson called Sarah at 7 in the morning, barely able to contain her excitement. This is it, Sarah. This is your chance to make a real impression. The Admiral obviously remembered your conversation from yesterday. I don't think it's appropriate, Sarah protested. The tour is probably intended for base personnel. Nonsense. His aide specifically mentioned spouses. You have to come. As the senior spouse, I'm making it an official recommendation. Sarah knew that refusing Linda's official recommendation would create more problems than accepting it. With deep reluctance, she agreed to join the tour. The air traffic control tower was a place Sarah had dreamed of visiting for years, but had never had the opportunity. As they climbed the stairs to the cab, she felt her pulse quickening with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The cab itself was a circular room with floor-to-ceiling windows providing a 360-degree view of the airfield. Controllers sat at sophisticated workstations, their movements precise and economical as they guided aircraft through complex patterns. The familiar sound of radio chatter filled the air, creating a symphony of controlled chaos that Sarah had once hoped to be part of. Admiral Richardson stood near the center of the room, listening intently as the tower chief explained the coordination process for the weekend's exercises. Several other spouses clustered nearby, looking somewhat overwhelmed by the technical complexity of the operation. The key, the tower chief was explaining, is maintaining separation between aircraft while maximizing runway efficiency. Each controller has to track multiple variables simultaneously: aircraft speed, wind conditions, runway availability, and traffic flow. "It sounds incredibly complex," one of the spouses commented. "It is," Admiral Richardson agreed, "which is why we need the best and brightest personnel in these positions." His gaze found Sarah across the room. "Mrs. Martinez, what's your impression of the operation?" Once again, Sarah found herself the center of attention, but this time she was surrounded by the very environment she had once dreamed of working in. The radio chatter, the radar displays, the controlled urgency of the controllers' voices. It all felt like coming home. "It's beautiful," she said without thinking. "The way they sequence the departures to optimize climb rates, how they vector the arrivals to maintain flow while accounting for wake turbulence separation. It's like watching a perfectly choreographed dance." The room fell silent except for the radio chatter. Even the controllers glanced over, surprised by the depth of her observation. Admiral Richardson's expression had changed completely, his polite interest replaced by sharp focus. "Mrs. Martinez," he said slowly, "that's not the perspective of someone who's simply interested in aviation. That's the analysis of someone who understands air traffic control at a professional level." Sarah realized she had crossed a line from which there might be no return. Her carefully maintained facade was crumbling, and everyone in that room could see it happening. James, who had just arrived for the latter part of the tour, stood in the doorway with a look of complete confusion on his face. The moment had come when Sarah Martinez would have to decide who she really was, and whether she was brave enough to let the world see the person she had been hiding for so many years. The week passed quickly, filled with the usual base preparations for high-level visits. Sarah found herself caught up in the whirlwind of activities, helping Linda organize the spouse luncheon and ensuring every detail met the exacting standards expected when admirals came calling. She polished silver, arranged flowers, and practiced her most gracious smile in the mirror. On Thursday evening, James came home with news that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. Admiral Richardson had arrived earlier than expected and would be touring the base facilities the next morning. Before the official ceremonies began, "He's particularly interested in our air traffic control operations," James explained as they sat down to dinner. "Apparently he's been advocating for improved coordination between military and civilian air traffic systems." Sarah nodded, cutting her chicken with perhaps more force than necessary. "That sounds important." "It is. The base commander wants everything to run like clockwork tomorrow. No mistakes, no confusion, no surprises." James looked tired, the stress of the week showing in the lines around his eyes. "I just want this whole thing to go smoothly so we can get back to normal." That night, Sarah lay awake listening to James's steady breathing beside her. Normal. What was normal anyway? Was it normal to hide such a significant part of yourself from the person you loved most? Was it normal to feel like you were constantly performing a role instead of living your authentic life? She thought back to her college days when her future had seemed so different. Back then she had been Sarah Chen, not Sarah Martinez. She had been studying aeronautical engineering with dreams of becoming an air traffic controller herself. She had spent countless hours in flight simulators, learning the complex dance of guiding aircraft safely through busy airspace. But then she met James at a friend's party, and everything changed. He was handsome, charming, and completely devoted to his naval career. Their romance was a whirlwind, and when he proposed after just 8 months, she said yes without hesitation. The only problem was that James had very traditional ideas about military marriages. He believed wives should support their husbands' careers, not pursue demanding careers of their own. So Sarah had set aside her dreams, transferring to an education program instead. She became the perfect Navy wife, supportive and understanding, never complaining about the long deployments or frequent moves. She buried her technical knowledge deep inside, only letting it surface in private moments when she watched planes overhead or caught glimpses of air traffic control towers. Friday morning arrived with perfect weather, clear skies and light winds ideal for flight operations. Sarah dressed carefully in her navy blue dress, the one James said brought out her eyes. She styled her long black hair in a conservative bun and applied just enough makeup to look polished but not overdone. The spouse luncheon was being held in the base's officers' club, a stately building with panoramic windows overlooking the flight line. Sarah arrived early to help with final preparations, arranging name cards and ensuring the floral centerpieces were perfectly positioned. "You look lovely, dear," Linda Peterson said, giving Sarah an approving once-over. "That color is perfect on you. Thank you. Is everything ready?" "Almost." The Admiral's aide called to say he might stop by briefly before the luncheon to meet some of the spouses. "Isn't that exciting?" Sarah's stomach lurched, but she maintained her composure. "Very exciting." As the other wives began arriving, the room filled with nervous chatter and excited energy. Everyone wanted to make a good impression on the Admiral. Sarah positioned herself near the back of the room, hoping to blend into the background as much as possible. At exactly 11:30, the doors opened, and Admiral Richardson entered the room. He was a distinguished man in his 50s, with silver hair and intelligent gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His uniform was impeccable, his bearing confident but not arrogant. "Ladies," he said with a warm smile, "thank you for the warm welcome to your beautiful base. I know how much you all contribute to the success of our naval operations, and I wanted to personally express my appreciation." The wives beamed at his words, and Linda stepped forward to make introductions. Sarah watched from her position near the windows, hoping the Admiral would simply shake a few hands and leave before the formal luncheon began. But fate had other plans. As Admiral Richardson worked his way around the room, his aide whispered something in his ear and pointed toward the flight line, where a complex training exercise was taking place. Multiple aircraft were executing intricate maneuvers while ground controllers coordinated their movements. "Impressive operation," the Admiral commented, moving toward the windows where Sarah stood. "The level of coordination required for exercises like this is remarkable." "Yes, sir," Linda agreed eagerly. "Our husbands work very hard to maintain the highest standards." The Admiral nodded, his gaze fixed on the aircraft below. "The precision required in air traffic control never ceases to amaze me. It's like conducting an orchestra, except the musicians are flying at 300 miles per hour. Without thinking, Sarah found herself speaking. "It's all about situational awareness and predictive thinking. The controllers have to see not just where the aircraft are, but where they're going to be, sometimes several minutes in advance." The room fell silent. Admiral Richardson turned to look at Sarah with renewed interest. "That's a very insightful observation, Mrs. Martinez," Sarah replied, her cheeks flushing. "Sarah Martinez. Mrs. Martinez. You seem to understand the complexities of air traffic control quite well." Sarah felt every eye in the room focused on her. She had spoken without thinking, letting her knowledge slip out in a moment of genuine interest. Now she had to decide how to respond. "I find it fascinating to watch," she said carefully. "My husband has explained some of the basics to me." Admiral Richardson studied her face intently. "I see. And what does your husband do here on base?" "He's a commander in operations planning, sir." "Ah, Commander Martinez. I've heard excellent things about his work." The Admiral paused, still watching Sarah's reaction to the aircraft movements below. "You know, Mrs. Martinez, I've been in the Navy for 32 years, and I've learned to recognize when someone truly understands aviation. Your comment about predictive thinking suggests more than casual interest." Sarah felt trapped. The Admiral's penetrating gaze seemed to see right through her carefully constructed facade. Around the room, the other wives watched with curiosity and perhaps a touch of concern. Linda looked particularly puzzled, as if she was seeing Sarah for the first time. "I suppose I've picked up more than I realized over the years," Sarah said, trying to sound casual. But Admiral Richardson wasn't satisfied with that answer. He gestured toward the window, where a particularly complex maneuver was taking place. "What would you say is happening down there right now?" Sarah looked at the aircraft, her trained eye automatically analyzing their positions, altitudes, and trajectories. She could see exactly what was happening, could predict the next several moves in the sequence. But revealing that knowledge would expose everything she had worked so hard to hide. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to say, sir," she replied diplomatically. The Admiral smiled, but it wasn't a smile of acceptance. It was the smile of someone who knew he was being given less than the complete truth. "Interesting," he murmured almost to himself. The tension in the room was palpable. Sarah could feel her carefully ordered world beginning to shift, like the first tremor before an earthquake. She had spent years building her identity as Commander Martinez's supportive wife, and now, with just a few carelessly spoken words, She had opened a door she wasn't sure she could close again. Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the naval base parking lot, watching her husband, Commander James Martinez, disappear into the administrative building. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine concrete, and she could hear the distant sound of sailors conducting their daily drills. At 28, Sarah had grown accustomed to the structured world of military life, but today felt different somehow. She adjusted the strap of her purse and walked toward the base commissary, nodding politely to the other military wives she recognized. Most of them knew her simply as Commander Martinez's wife, the quiet woman who attended the monthly spouse meetings and helped organize charity events. What they didn't know was that Sarah had her own secrets, her own past that she kept carefully hidden behind her role as a devoted Navy wife. The commissary buzzed with its usual morning activity. Sarah grabbed a shopping cart and began making her way through the aisles, picking up groceries for the week. She moved with purpose, her movements efficient and deliberate. Years of living on bases around the world had taught her to be organized, to make the most of every shopping trip. "Sarah, there you are," called out Linda Peterson, the wife of Captain Peterson. Linda was the unofficial leader of the spouses group, a woman in her 40s who took great pride in knowing everyone's business. She hurried over with her cart, her perfectly styled blonde hair bouncing with each step. "Good morning, Linda," Sarah replied with a polite smile. She had learned early in her marriage that maintaining good relationships with the other wives was essential for James's career. Any drama or conflict could reflect poorly on him, and she refused to be the reason for any setbacks in his advancement. "I'm so glad I ran into you," Linda continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Did you hear about the new Admiral? Admiral Richardson is supposed to arrive next week for the joint training exercises. They say he's very particular about protocol and tradition." Sarah nodded, continuing to place items in her cart. "James mentioned something about it. I'm sure everything will go smoothly." "Oh, I hope so," Linda said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "You know how these high-ranking visitors can be. Everything has to be perfect. The spouse luncheon next Friday will be especially important. I do hope you'll be there to help with the preparations." "Of course," Sarah agreed, though she felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. Large gatherings always made her nervous, not because she was shy, but because she worried about letting something slip, revealing too much about herself. As Linda continued chatting about the upcoming events, Sarah's mind wandered to her conversation with James the night before. He had been unusually tense, poring over personnel files and training schedules. The joint exercises were a big deal, involving multiple branches of the military and several allied nations. Everything had to be executed flawlessly. "You seem distracted, dear," Linda observed, studying Sarah's face. "Is everything all right at home?" "Everything's fine," Sarah replied quickly. "Just thinking about all the preparations we'll need to make." Linda smiled approvingly. "That's the spirit. A good Navy wife always thinks ahead. Speaking of which, have you given any thought to volunteering for the air traffic control demonstration? They're looking for wives to help with the presentation for the Admiral." Sarah nearly dropped the box of cereal she was holding. "Air traffic control? Oh yes, it's just a simple demonstration of how the base coordinates with civilian air traffic. Nothing too complicated. They just need someone to help explain the basics to the visiting dignitaries." "I think I'll pass on that one," Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I'm sure there are others more qualified." "Nonsense. You're one of the most intelligent women in our group. James always speaks so highly of your education." Sarah changed the subject quickly, asking about Linda's daughter's upcoming graduation. As Linda launched into a detailed account of college preparations, Sarah felt herself relaxing again. She had become an expert at deflecting conversations away from topics that might reveal too much about her background. After finishing her shopping, Sarah drove home to the modest base housing unit she shared with James. The house was identical to dozens of others on the street, with its regulation white walls and small front yard. She had done her best to make it feel like home, adding colorful throw pillows and family photos, but it still felt temporary. Everything in military life felt temporary. As she unpacked the groceries, Sarah found herself thinking about the upcoming Admiral's visit. She wondered what Admiral Richardson was like, whether he was one of those old-school officers who believed women belonged only in supporting roles, or if he was more progressive in his thinking. Either way, she would play her part perfectly, just as she always did. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was James calling from his office. Hey, sweetheart. His familiar voice came through the receiver. How was your morning? Good. I ran into Linda at the commissary. She mentioned the air traffic control demonstration for the Admiral. There was a pause on the other end. Are you interested in helping with that? No, I told her I'd rather not. You know how I feel about those technical presentations? Right, of course. Listen, I might be late tonight. We're going over the flight schedules for next week's exercises. This Admiral visit has everyone on edge. I understand. I'll keep dinner warm for you. After hanging up, Sarah stood in her kitchen, looking out the window at the other wives going about their daily routines. Mrs. Johnson was hanging laundry on her back porch. Mrs. Thompson was playing with her toddler in the small front yard. Normal, everyday activities of normal, everyday military wives. But Sarah Martinez was not entirely normal, and she was not entirely everyday. Hidden in her past was a truth that could change everything, a secret that even her beloved husband didn't fully understand. As she watched a formation of fighter jets practice maneuvers overhead, she felt a familiar stirring in her chest, a longing for something she had given up when she chose love over career. The jets disappeared into the distance, leaving only contrails in the clear blue sky. Sarah took a deep breath and returned to her domestic duties, carefully maintaining the facade that had become her life. But deep down, she knew that the upcoming Admiral's visit would test that facade in ways she couldn't yet imagine.